Welcome to JonGetsGames. Today I'll be reviewing Manhattan Project Energy Empire. This game was designed by Luke Lowry and Tom Jolly, and this is a worker placement style engine building game, but you only get to activate parts of your engine dependent on what part of the board you activate with your workers. You are going to be building this engine larger, you're going to get more workers, and specifically get more and more energy as your infrastructure grows. First I'll explain how the game plays, and then I'll jump into my review. Here's an example of a player's area at the beginning of the game. They start with 3 workers and 2 energy, but as the game goes on, they'll have the ability to generate 3 more workers and up to 10 energy total, but they'll build into that later on. Players now need to decide what country they will be representing for the game, and they'll do that by taking 2 of these cards and picking from one of them. Along the top, they'll see their starting resources, which might also be extra energy dice or workers at the beginning of the game, and down the bottom, they will see the requirements for bumping up on the United Nations track. So let's say this player chose France. They can flip this one over, it gives them a handy-dandy player reference sheet. And lastly, they draw 2 achievements, pick one of them, and it'll be some endgame victory points, which I'll talk about later. There is one other part of setup that I want to explain before we jump into the gameplay. Now, that is all of these different stacks that have these little pollution tokens in them. And this is going to vary based on the player count. In a hypothetical 3-player game, we have 5 in each of these stacks, and then over here we have the event cards. There are 9 total of these green early events, and 6 total of these red late game events. You shuffle them up, you pull 3 out of each, and those will be the ones you play with in the game. On a player's turn, they can either work or generate, and I'll explain how working works first. So they'll take a worker and put them out onto one of these worker placement spots, which you can notice by this little symbol with the person with the helmet. And when they put this worker down, they will immediately evaluate the action for that spot. So for instance, if they went right here, they would immediately generate 1 steel. In general, all of these actions are pretty self-explanatory. For instance, this one right here would allow a player to put a oil well down onto their player board in order to generate 3 of these oil barrels. This right here would let them spend one of these oil barrels in order to get a couple plastic, a science token, and they'd have to put a pollution down on their board. Then over here we have a spot where they can take money, but then if they choose to take even more money, their opponents will get some money. They can trade oil barrels for money. And then over here they can also generate science tokens. They can convert science tokens into recycling actions, as well as generate new workers for themselves. Down here we have the power plant action spot, and this is special because it's the only way for players to generate more of these energy dice. And they'll be rolling these later, and I'll explain how that works, but as you can see, they just spend the required resources in order to take the associated die. Lastly, we have these 3 very large market sections, and this is where players will be able to purchase these buildings and put them into their tableau. Now, when you go into this area, you can only buy the buildings associated with that colored spot. So here would be the industry market, this is the commerce market, and over here we have the government, and the price to purchase each of these buildings is listed along the top. It'll either be money or a certain number of the associated resource with that area. So with industrial, you spend money or steel. And once you buy one of these cards, you then slide the remaining ones over and refill the row immediately. Let's look at this building in a little more detail. We see in the top left this 3-star, which means that this player will get 3 points at the end of the game for having this building. And importantly, in the top right, we see that this building is going to give them pollution. It's going to be a regular pollution, and it has to go into the air for their area. And if we look at their starting area, everybody starts with 1 pollution in the air. And in the game, whenever you take pollution for any reason except for events, you need to grab it from the top of these stacks over here on the leftmost side, and then you can put it down in any of the correctly matching spots on your player board. In general, it makes most sense to go farthest to the left, and you'll notice that we just covered up a 1-star, which means at certain parts of the game, including at the end of the game, this could potentially be worth points for us as long as it's not actually covered up by pollution. And most importantly, the player now has this building in their tableau so that they can do actions with it. After they do a work action by putting a worker out on any of the spots on the board, they can then activate as many of their personal buildings as they want to of the matching associated part of the board. So since we put a worker in the industrial portion of the board, we can activate all industrial buildings we want. But if, for instance, the player also had a government building, they would not be able to do anything with this until a future turn when they do a work action in the left third of the board. Whenever you activate your structures, you'll notice that you can spend either energy or workers to evaluate this action. And some buildings have these 2 different spots, and what this means is you can spend one of these once in order to get the bonus. In this case, you would generate a steel for your player area, but you would not be able to do the other one until you do another industrial work action. There are also cards out there that just have a single spot that can only be activated once until it is cleared out with the generate action, which I'll explain very soon. And there are other ones that require you to spend 2 energy, 2 workers, or an energy and a worker to get the benefit, but in general, these are a much better action. You may have noticed the symbol at the bottom of our nation card matches that on our structures, and that means that whenever you do any work action on the board, our nation is effectively wild and you can activate the action down on the bottom. You simply spend the resources on the left in order to bump once up on the United Nations track. So in this instance, the player could use this one worker, spend 1 science and 2 money, and they bump themselves up on the track, effectively generating themselves 4 points at the end of the game. You'll notice that the points go up the farther you go, although the gap between them gets smaller until you get to this last spot, which can only take a single worker's spot, and that is going to be 17 points, plus at the end of the game, whoever is farthest along on this track, even if they're not at the end, is going to get a bonus of 3 points. Before I go any further, let's talk about what happens when you want to activate a zone that already has a worker in it. Now, this could be a worker of your own color or one of your opponents, and the rules are simple. You are allowed to activate that spot as long as you spend enough energy to make your new worker stack higher than the previous one. So in this instance, this was just a stack of 1, so the yellow player is able to activate this because they spent the 1 energy. If the green player wants to come back in here and use this spot, that's fine, but in this case, they would need to spend at least 2 energy with this activation. It's also worth noting that a player can spend more energy than they need to in order to make it harder for an opponent to follow in on that action. We've talked about a couple ways that players can generate pollution, but let's now talk in a little more specifics of how you can clean it up. This symbol right here is a recycle action, and for instance, this spot on the board would allow the player to spend 1 science to get 2 of these recycle actions. And for each of these actions, a player can remove one of their regular pollution from the board, or they can remove one of their oil rigs, whether it be on land or in the water, or if they happen to have one of these really bad nuclear pollutions, they can spend an action to flip it over to regular pollution and then spend another action to remove that from their board. We've talked a whole bunch about what players can do with a work action on their turn, but instead of doing a work action, they can choose to generate. And they're either going to do this when they've run out of workers and or energy, or once they just have nothing else they necessarily want to do. Now, the first thing that happens when you decide to do a generate action is you look to see if you have at least 2 workers or energy or any combination of thereof, and if you do, then you can pull one of these new achievement tiles from the board, and these once again are endgame points that you can flip over and put into your achievement stack. And then any excess energy that was not spent is going to be lost. Next, they bring all of their workers home and ditch any energy that they use to activate any of their buildings. And now they generate their energy die pool. Now, this player, for instance, has a yellow and a green die. You can choose to use some or all of your dice if you want, and you can spend up to 5 of your oil barrels at a 1-to-1 rate in order to get these petroleum dice, which you can then roll once for this specific round, and then you lose the option for the future rounds, so it's a reason to keep generating oil. So let's say the player decides they're going to do all of these dice, they're going to roll them up, and they see what the results are. First of all, we want to look to see what the biggest number is, and we see that in one way they're a D6, there's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 on them, and this petroleum die has a 6. The die that has the highest number is going to be the one that dictates if a player is going to get any pollution. So they're going to get 1 regular pollution because this was the highest. However, if this yellow die had been the highest, you'll see it actually gives them nuclear pollution. It's also worth noting that if they had rolled a 6 with this green die right here, then whenever you have a tie, it actually goes in your favor, and you can choose which of these dice is going to evaluate for you on your pollution. So obviously, in this case, they would choose not to take any pollution. But whether or not a player actually has to put pollution on their board, they're going to take 1 pollution from the top of this stack, and they'll discard it if they don't have to take it, or they'll put it down on their board, either with the regular side or the nuclear side, depending on how their dice rolled. And lastly, they simply count up all of their energy symbols. In this case, we see 7, and that's the amount of energy that they get to play with in the next round. It's worth noting that there is this handy table on every player's sheet, so you can see how much energy they'll get on any of the specific die faces for all 5 of the dice that can be rolled. Let's now talk about what happens once the last of these pollution tokens are taken from one of these stacks. The player is going to finish out their action, and then they will immediately evaluate the next of these events on the track. You'll notice that there are 3 of these green events at first, and then there are actually 3 of these red events. And the green events are generally nice to all of the players, and the red events are not. So let's go ahead and flip over the first event to see what these look like. The first thing to note up on the top is each player is going to score points for the number of uncovered pieces of their environment that is associated with this card. So in this instance, they would get points for their air. Next up, they would look to see this symbol, and all of the buildings that match this symbol on that part of the board, in this case, government, would get wiped from the board and refreshed, so it's just one way to see more of the buildings. And lastly, there is going to be a global effect that's going to affect all of the players. Once again, the green effects in general help players, and for these red cards, they are generally meaner. For instance, with this market crash, it's going to be harder to build buildings. And then we have, let's see, this one right here. This is a pandemic. Players will lose access to some of their workers. And this last one over here, nuclear fallout. It sprinkles nuclear pollution all out onto the board, onto the spots that people want to go to. So this is a way that players are going to be scoring points, one of the ways, in the middle of the game 6 different times, and a way for the game to bring in variety to each gameplay, since there are several of these cards to choose from when you do setup. Lastly, it's worth noting that players will not always be in the dark as to what new events are going to come out, because whenever they do an action that has this symbol, they will be able to peek at a future event, look at it, and then put it back down, and then try to make decisions based on their knowledge of the future. Once the final pollution is taken from the track, the last event will be evaluated as normal, and then all players are going to take one more turn, including the player who triggered the endgame, and at that point, the game will be over and they can go into final scoring. At this point, all players will add up several things to the score they've already generated throughout the game. They'll start with their achievements, which they can have a maximum of 5 of, and each achievement can generate a maximum of 5 points each. Then they will add in all of the points for their buildings. Next, all of the uncovered points on their player board, and they'll get these bonuses if they have completely clear columns associated with them. And over here, we see that they will also get points for the number of dice that they were able to make, up to a maximum of 5. Lastly, they're going to add in their United Nations points, which are going to equal the spot where their token is, and an extra 3 points if they happen to be the farthest down on the track. At that point, they look to see who has the most points, and they're the winner. Let's now begin the review for Energy Empire by covering a couple positive points. And the first of these relates to the act of engine building and the novel ideas that come into play with this game. And right from the get-go, I want to say that I'm going to be covering the engine building aspect here and not really the engine running, because that is going to come into play a little bit later on in this review. But specifically talking about the act of creating the engine in front of you gives you a wonderful variety of interesting decisions, because you need to think about what style of engine you are going to be building, because you might go for several buildings in all the different colors, which leaves you more flexible out on the main board, because you could put a worker over here and activate these, and put a worker over there and activate those, versus maybe just going really hard on one of the colors, which means that your options out on the board are going to become more restricted because you've overly incentivized one of the colors, and that's just another style of engine that you can build yourself towards. And it is fun trying to seek out the combinations between the buildings from the different colors, or even just within a color, and trying to have those combo with each other, as well as comboing with the various options that are out on the board. So there is a wonderful sense of scaling and progression as you play through the game. At the very beginning of the game, there you have no buildings at all, and you are going to ramp into having a whole bunch of buildings. I think the fewest buildings I've ever seen anybody end the game with is like 5 or 6, and I've seen people end the game with like 9 or 10 of these if they go really hard on acquiring those. So there's a great sense of kind of accomplishment of really doing things and approaching a much larger end game, and you just have so many more things you can do in the process of actually building out this engine. And I love the decisions that are inherent in the process of actually putting those pieces together. Positive point number 2 relates to the actual workers themselves, but specifically the 2 different types of workers in this game. You have the actual human little worker tokens, and then you have the energy tokens. And they both behave a lot like workers in this various style of game. Now, if you want to activate a location out on the main board, you must use your little human workers, but there's a neat little twist in that you can bolster that worker by adding energy to them. You might need to do this if you want to go to a spot where somebody else already is, because you need to make your stack higher, and you can't add extra workers. You just have to add always one worker plus energy to at least get higher. But hypothetically, if you didn't want other people going to that one spot, you could put more energy there, although I haven't really seen that happen, just to make it even more expensive for other people to go there. But it is potentially an option. But then when you look down at all the buildings that you've been purchasing throughout the game, you can activate all of those with your human workers or your energy worker. And that means that both of these tokens are really effective and useful in a couple different ways. And as you are actually playing through the game, you have some pretty good decisions when it comes to how you want to spend these workers, because probably like halfway through the game, you might have 3 to 5 workers. It kind of depends on how you've been playing that one game. And then you might also be looking at 5 or 6 energy production at that point. And so on your turn, you might be thinking, when you're activating your buildings, do I put workers down there or do I put energy down there? And I really need to balance these things back and forth, because if you use too many workers down there, then you are going to limit the number of overall actions you can do on the main board, because every one of those needs a human worker. But if you spend too much of your energy down below and then just have workers, then you're going to restrict the options you have out on the main board, because you won't be able to go to where your opponents are, because they've already got that spot in there and you have to get higher. And if you don't save that energy around, then that's going to be a problem. So I love the fact that this game has these two different styles of workers, and I really like how they have strengths and weaknesses between them, and it is an enjoyable experience trying to figure out how best to utilize them as a resource. Let's now shift over into a few neutral points, and the first of these has to do with the other engine in this game, and that is the energy dice that you are going to be acquiring and rolling every single time you do a generate action, and these will give you those vital energy tokens that you're going to be spending as workers in order to do all the cool stuff as you're playing. So there are a couple different aspects to these dice, and some of these things I really like, and some of these things I don't, which is why we're in the neutral section with this. The On one side, I like that these going really hard and having lots of these dice does not appear to be a dominant strategy. I've seen people play very well having just 2 or 3 dice at the end of the game, going the whole way through, perhaps using the oil barrels, which you can acquire with relative ease to just turn into one-time use dice when they're doing the generate actions. But I've also seen people do really well when they early on try to just buy 5 energy dice, and they just get tons of energy early in the game. They work really well with that. But of course, you are spending a rather large amount of resources and time just getting those dice out, especially considering there's only one spot on the board where you can go to actually purchase those dice. It can be hotly contested, so you're going to be giving up even more energy tokens in order to go in that spot when other people are there. So from an engine perspective, I enjoy the process of figuring out which dice to actually grab because, the yellow dice give you tons of energy, but that nuclear pollution is terrible. So if you get that yellow die, you probably want to get several of the other ones to try to and dilute that down. It is interesting kind of syncing all these different types of dice together, or just saying, I'm just going oil with the brown and the black dice, and I'm just going to take up one regular pollution every single time and not really worry about it. So the flip side to the dice is that you have to roll these, and this is definitely a Euro style game where with the worker placement and the engine building, and then you get to this point where you roll the dice, there is zero mitigation, there's zero dice manipulation, and you just deal with the outcome. And then on top of that, this is not the kind of game where the die roll gives you branching decision tree and options, but you can't really roll badly. In this game, you can. If you roll low, that is bad. If you roll high, that is good for you. I guess if you roll high and just barely higher with your potentially bad dice, then you're going to be getting that pollution. But if you tie with your 2 highest dice, which does happen somewhat often, then it goes in your favor and you can use the die that is probably not going to give you pollution. So I've definitely seen many occasions where somebody rolls the dice and they get the worst possible outcome. They roll like maybe 3 or 4 dice, and the next person rolls 1 or 2 less dice. They get the best possible outcome, and they get the same or more energy for that next round. And it just feels it takes the wind out of your sails a little bit because there is no way to flip those dice around, and because there are some sides that are just worse than others. Like I feel like if they had done a sort of thing where the better dice that give you more energy at the lower die rolls where they give you less energy, maybe they don't actually give you pollution or just something like that to mitigate. So a low roll is not necessarily bad, it's just different. In this game, low rolls are bad. They are going to happen. And fortunately, you roll the dice enough that it usually averages out and it's not that big of a deal. So I haven't seen it tank any one game or have somebody say, I lost because I rolled poorly the whole time. But I did play a game once where I had a yellow nuclear die, and it seemed like that just was hitting at like a 3 or 4 every single time I rolled it, and my little blue die and my green die were always ahead of it. And I just never put a nuclear pollution down, and I don't remember if I won that game or not, but I do remember feeling a little bit guilty as to how lucky I was being. And I think in that situation, at least one of the other players had one of those rolls where they just rolled like 1, 1, 1, 2, and the 2 was the thing that gave them bad pollution. And they're just like, ugh, it's really unfortunate in that mode. And it definitely sets you back for the number of options you can do for that next wave of putting your workers out before you do another generate action. And I guess if you have that really bad roll, then maybe you'll just do 1 or 2 actions and then generate again to try and roll the die and do better and just not languish in that low energy state for too long, and you can maybe grab an achievement. So there are ways to play around it, but at the end of the day, this output randomness with zero mitigation is going to turn some people off. I don't hate it. I also don't love it in this game. It works okay, but I feel like maybe it could have been done a little better. For neutral number 2, I want to discuss the event card mechanic, and these are the 6 cards that are flipped over and evaluated when you get to those 6 different spots as you're playing the game. The first 3 are nice to the players, and the last 3 are kind of mean. I like the thematic integration that these have, where it's going to make one game play differently from the next. It also kind of tries to tie you into the world a little bit more. You might have like a worker strike or a pandemic or nuclear fallout, and it's kind of neat to see how they mechanically work into the constructs of the game. You know, if you have nuclear fallout, well, then the players put nuclear tokens down, and you have to take those if you want to evaluate those actions. If there's a pandemic, then everybody loses a worker for that amount of time, and they get it back later because they were sick. That all makes sense. But the flip side is, I don't know if they're actually interesting enough to necessarily warrant the inclusion of the extra rules for them, as well as the extra variants. Now, of course, there is that ability that is somewhat prevalent. It's out on the main board that lets you peek at future events. But I have not seen players prioritize that very highly, and I have not seen people get overly penalized because of that. It seems like when you flip over these events, you are going to, well, you're going to score points for one of the three different types of environments. Usually one player is going to get 1 or 2 more points than everybody else, but everybody gets about the same amount of points. And when the game is over, people usually have lots of points, like, scores of like 80 or even cracking over 100 are somewhat common. So 6 times in the game, netting 1 or 2 extra points on one of your opponents does not feel like a huge difference. And that is the way that those scorings tend to work out. It seems like people usually peek at those cards as a secondary bonus for doing the primary thing that they wanted to do. Like, they went to that location for the other thing, but, oh, I guess I get to peek at an event. Oh, okay, now I know, and maybe I'll get 1 extra point in the game because I'm going to clean up my environment slightly differently than everybody else. So I like the idea of the events. When I first read about them, I thought, oh, you'd see somebody peek, and then you'd play off of how they're playing because they have information that you don't have. And I haven't really seen that actually happen. So I don't dislike any aspect to the events. I mean, there is the randomness of flipping over the tile, and it could particularly harm you, but in general, they're global, and they kind of affect everybody, and I've never seen anybody get really messed over more than anybody else at the table because of one of those card flips. I just am pretty unenthusiastic about them in general, and I think if you pull them out of the game, it would not really affect the game state that much. To a certain degree, those first 3 events, they kind of kickstart things. They give you free stuff, which will kind of get your engine going a little bit faster. But I feel like that those little kickstarts could have been integrated into other aspects of the game by just making something a little bit cheaper here or there. Anyway, I'm not going to be taking these out. It's not a big deal. I just feel like it was a bit of a underwhelming missed opportunity to make the events much more interesting and a provocative part of the game than they actually ended up being. For neutral point number 3, I'll be discussing the various nations that you get to be when you start the game. And I love starting out pretty much any style of game with asymmetries, especially Euro games. It's just neat starting out at the beginning of the game with your own little thing that you maybe do a little bit better than everybody else, and it's going to dictate how this one play is going to be maybe different from previous plays that you've done. And I like the inclusion of these different nations in the game, but I guess a lot like the events, I feel a little bit underwhelmed by how they actually feel when I go ahead and play them. They do 2 things for you, essentially. They dictate your starting resources, and then they dictate the resources that you need to spend in order to bump up on the United Nations track. So that is a special action that you have. You know, they're custom resource styles just for you that nobody else is kind of vying for those specific resources. But man, that United Nations track is pretty boring. It's just points. There's no in-game benefits, there's no bonuses or anything. And in fact, as you hit that track more and more, the points you get for those jumps gets less and less until you get to that final spot. The one person who goes there gets the 5-point bump. And it feels almost like a chore, like something you probably should keep doing. Okay, well, I happen to have a science and a steel, so yeah, and I have 1 energy, I'll go ahead and do that. Kind of keep up with the pack because I don't want to fall too far behind, because there is a lot of points to be had over there, but it's not like a fun, interesting thing. I'm not like, oh yeah, I'm pumping up the United Nations more. That's fun. It's more like, oh, I got to figure out a way to do that so I don't just lose because I didn't push that token often enough. And the asymmetry between the ability to bump your token and your opponent to bump their token, it feels kind of not even necessary. Like, I think if we all had the same exact cost to bump our tokens, it would evaluate somewhat similarly. I mean, I guess this is going to dictate how you purchase buildings, so you are maybe slightly better at getting science and steel so that you can bump up your tokens. So there's a little bit of variety there, but it doesn't feel that overly impactful. It almost feels like the more important thing is your starting resources, and specifically, do you start with an energy or die or not? Not all of the countries do. In fact, I think many of them don't. And when they don't, they usually give you a few barrels of oil so that you can spend those for your first few generate phases in order to roll those dice and get extra energy. But it just kind of feels like every time I sat down to play it, if one of my 2 options had a die on it, I did that. I started with the die. It just seemed like a good idea. It's an extra 2 points at the end of the game, and it's just a little bit of infrastructure I don't have to focus on as much in the earlier parts of the game, or I just focus on it and I just have more dice than everybody. And in general, I tend to make more energy than them, or they have to spend the petroleum, use the petroleum dice, and maybe get more pollution. So I just wish the asymmetries were stronger. I wish there was maybe like an actual ability that affected some, like maybe even just one spot out on the board. It made it better for you. So you maybe hit that one more often than other people did. I wish there were bonuses maybe for the first person to get to different thresholds on the United Nations track, or just everybody when they get to that one spot, giving a specific thing that makes you, get a little bit of a dopamine hit, like, ooh, yay, that's cool, because now I can do this and that, as opposed to being like, yay, I now have 3 more points at the end of the game. My score will be 85 instead of 82. That's not that great, and just, again, a bit of a missed opportunity. I wish the asymmetries were stronger and more interesting. And lastly, we have neutral number 4, and I want to discuss the surprisingly low amount of player interaction that actually happens when you're playing this game. It is a worker placement style game, and there is a bit of a precedent for this style of game of having lots of indirect conflict and interactions as you take spots that your opponents want. Now they can't do that, and you take things away that they wanted. Now they have to totally change all their plans. But in this game, in general, it felt like if my opponent to my right went on a spot that I really wanted to go to, I'd kind of shrug my shoulders, spend 1 extra energy, and do it anyway. It's possible that I'm out of energy in that moment, but if I'm out of energy, odds are actually good I'm just going to be doing a generate action anyway. So that's not really going to impact me at all. So losing that 1 energy could have a somewhat sizable impact on the actual play of the game. Don't want to downplay how much 1 energy could do. It could be the difference between grabbing an achievement or not when you generate, and that could be 1 to 5 victory points, which could mean you win the game or not. But that is a end game thing. That's way at the end of the game. You're not really thinking about that. There isn't anything in this exact moment that you're like, oh man, now I can't do this or that because of that. Maybe based on your engine, you now can't put that 1 energy down, and it means you're not going to get an extra money or 2, or maybe a steal. Like, it will occasionally upset your plans a little bit, but it never sends you back to the drawing board. And sometimes I like a game to occasionally force me to completely rethink what I'm going to be doing and not just get away with all of the plans that I was planning as I was playing the game. Now, I do like multiplayer solitaire games in general, so this is not a critique of this game at all. I don't mind the amount of interaction. I was just surprised at how low it was, and this also means that it's kind of hard to to kind of slow down somebody who appears to be doing really well. I have not seen a runaway leader situation in this game, but I have seen plays of this where it seems like one person is doing better than everybody else, and the game keeps going, and the game ends, and they win, and nobody's surprised. And they don't necessarily win by a humongous amount of points, but they just kind of get in the lead, and they just kind of stay there because you can't really upset people's plans that much. You maybe make them spend 1 extra energy, but especially if they're doing well and they're making an engine, then that 1 energy is going to matter even less to them. So this is, again, not necessarily criticism. This might actually be a big positive for a lot of people who enjoy very low interaction with their Euro games, and this might be, if the general amount of interaction in worker placement games is a bit too much for you, then definitely look into this one. It might fit your style much better than your average style worker placement game. So it's just something I think you should know about when you go ahead and sit down to play the game. Let's now move over into the negatives, and I only have 1 to cover, but it is somewhat significant. This has to do with kind of what I was talking about at the very beginning of the review, the difference between building your engine and actually running it. So I like the act of putting your pieces together with your engine, trying to make these combos with 1 building, giving you resources to lead into another building, into another building. But I have seen a couple issues when it comes to actually running your engine, and it specifically has to do with when you do a single color style engine. Because once again, you can go heavy on 1 specific color of your buildings, or you could kind of spread your building colors out between the 3, which is going to give you more options out on the main board. The problem I have is that I think you are overly incentivized to go really heavy with 1 specific color. If you are just playing the game to win and not necessarily playing the game to try different things. And the reason for that is because, well, when you activate one of those, one section of that part of the board, you're going to activate all of those building types. So you can be more efficient with your building activation if you keep getting buildings of the same color. And it feels like once you get to the point, if you're playing the game and you get like 2, maybe 3 buildings of 1 color and maybe none of the others, it's so easy to just buy that 4th building of that color and then buy that 5th building and then just keep running your little combo, because you probably bought these buildings so that they worked well together because you're thinking about making some cool engine building. And that's kind of fun, but you get to the point where you no longer really build your engine anymore. Now you have like 5, 6, maybe even 7 buildings with the same color, and all you do is do a generate action, and on your next turn, you activate one of the spots of that color, and then you dump all of your workers down, and you dump all of your energy out, you activate all of your buildings, and on the following turn, you do another generate action. And if you planned it well, maybe you have 2 energy left over or energy in a worker in order to grab achievements, which is going to give you points. Then you roll the dice, get energy, and then on your next turn, you do that action again, and you just dump all your stuff out. And it gets to the point where it feels like you're just cranking handle. Like you're no longer making decisions. You figured out the optimum way to run the engine that's in front of you, and now you're just going through the motions. Like, okay, so I get 2 money, and then I spend that 2 money to get the oil, and then I use the oil to turn it into plastic, and then and you know what the little plan is, and you just keep running through it. And it feels like when you do this style of strategy, when you're playing the game, it feels like you do it too many times. And it's weird to complain about an engine building game where you run your engine too much, but when you stop modifying your engine and you stop making decisions about your engine, then it almost feels like, why am I here? I built this thing, now let's just see if this thing ends up outpacing and winning everybody else in the game, and I'm just gonna, be a slave to my engine as opposed to me commanding my engine. So I feel like the issue here is that there's too much incentivization to do that because of the action efficiency of activating those buildings. I wish they had put some sort of break in the game that slowed down the incentive for that third building of a color, for that fourth building of a color. Maybe make them more expensive or add extra pollution, or just I'm really not sure. I'm not necessarily a game designer, but I feel like they needed something to push players into going into other aspects of the board, because the other part is once you find yourself locked in on that little cycle, you just ignore the 2/3 of the board, and that's just not what you want to be doing. I've enjoyed the game way more when I've forced myself to go with multiple different colored buildings across my player area, but in general, I've kind of felt like I do not as well as than if I had just gone crazy with that one color. I've not played this game enough times to say that a one color strategy is dominant and the multicolor building strategy is too weak, but I can tell you that playing the multicolor building strategy is more fun, but whenever I've done it, I felt like I am not doing as well as that other person because they are getting so many of those achievements. Like they're going to max out to the 5 achievements at the end of the game. That's pretty much the only way I've seen people get to the point where they can do that, as opposed to the people who do the multicolor ones, because those multicolor building people are going to take 2, 3, maybe even 4 actions before they do another generate. And each one of those actions gives you interesting decisions. But it seems like when you get to that point in the game, when you generate, you get all those points for the achievements, and then you get to redump into your huge, complex, cool engine that you built. It just doesn't really seem to compare. So I think I've covered this one enough. I wish there was some disincentivization to stop players from going really hard on one color. If I play this game again, and I do plan on playing this game more, I will focus on not finding myself suckered into that little black hole of just going with one color. It's going to be hard because that's just the way the game seems to be pulling me, but I will not do that just so I have a more pleasurable, enjoyable experience. It's now time to discuss the variability for Energy Empire, and I think that it's pretty average. And it had a couple opportunities to break away and actually be above average when it comes to the asymmetric nations that you can pick at the beginning of the game, as well as the different events that get shuffled up and put out that will make the different effects on the game board differently from one game to the next. But as I mentioned in the neutral points, I feel like both of those didn't quite live up to their potential when it came to modifying the game in interesting ways. And so I feel like every time I've sat down to play the game, it's been an average amount of replayability. Like I feel like I'm playing pretty much the same style of game. Like I might be slightly more incentivized to go with steel in this game and slightly more incentivized in the next game to make some oil because of that nation. But it does not feel like any more than I would expect from the average Euro game I sat down to play with at the table. Energy Empire plays 1 to 5 players, but I'm not going to comment on 1 because I just don't play solo games that much and I did not try it in this game. But I did play the 2, 3, and 4 player game, and I can say that I think that 3 player is the best way to play this game for the somewhat standard Euro game reasons. When you play this at 2, it does work, but it's nice having a little bit more opponents around the table. Also, if somebody appears to be doing well, then having 2 people trying to keep that person in check is a little bit better than a single person trying to do that. The 2-player game did play well. It's got a variant where essentially, not variant, but you put down workers from a neutral color onto all the building spaces, so you're always going to have to spend extra energy in order to pick up those buildings. It just crowds the board in a little bit so that you have to deal with that. But I think when I played it at the 4-player game, it was fine, but it felt like it maybe started to get a little long when it came to downtime in general. It was not too bad, and I certainly wouldn't say no to playing this game at 4 players again, but I have not played it at 5 players, and I won't. That's a decision I've made. It just feels like it's not worth having that extra player. Like, there's no incentive for having that extra player. Like, it doesn't make my play more interesting. I guess it crowds the board in a little bit more, so there's more player interaction, but that's just even more downtime before I get to take another turn. There's nothing that you can do when it's not your turn, so maybe you could plan things out, but there's only so much planning you can do in this game. I've never found myself having it come back to me and being like, I still don't know what I want to do. So that's the reason I haven't gone up to that count. So yeah, I would recommend it at 2 to 4, and 3 is likely best. In conclusion, I've played Energy Empire 4 times at this point, and I've enjoyed every single one of those plays. But there's an interesting thing going on here where I feel like I'm not actually that excited to keep playing it. Like, I do want to play it again, and if one of my friends asks me to play it, I will definitely sit down and do it because there's some really great stuff in here. There's good decisions. There's a really cool tweak on engine building. But for some reason, there are just several little things that just bring down the overall excitement level for the game. And I think it is a combination of the asymmetries not quite living up to what I wanted them to be, the events not really changing things up that much. There is very low player interaction. Like, it definitely happens, but maybe a little bit less than I would in general like for the game. And then, as I mentioned in that one negative, I feel like I'm constantly pushing myself away from this feeling like, just go hard on that one color, just do it. You'll be more incentivized. You'll get much more bang for your action by activating all of those buildings and then just not actually enjoying the process of running those engines. I feel like if those little things had been tweaked, if those aspects were more interesting, and if they'd put the brakes on finding yourself in kind of a boring engine to actually evaluate, my excitement level for this game would be much higher because it's a really good game. Like, all 3 of those things I just said feel like nitpicks. Like, oh, a couple things are not quite as interesting as I want, and oh, this one strategy is just a little bit too incentivized. But when you add all those together, it has a slight deflating effect on my overall impression of the game. So I can't say that this is a bad game. In fact, I think it is a very good game with a couple little things that just kind of, maybe it's like a death by several paper cuts in this case. And I think death is an overstatement because I'm going to be keeping this game. I do enjoy it, and I am looking forward to playing it more in the future. I just don't think it quite lived up to the hype and excitement that I had for it after the first time I read through the rules. Like, seeing all these ideas with the events and with asymmetries and with this really cool take on engine building, I was very excited to see how it all came together. And at the end of the day, I only liked it. I didn't end up loving it. At this point, I'd like to thank everyone who has been continually supporting this channel through Patreon, including all of these producer-level pledges. If you too would like to help the channel out by directly supporting it, you could do so at patreon.com/JonGetsGames, and I'd really appreciate it. Also, if you'd like to see more in-depth board game reviews like this one, as well as full game playthroughs and the monthly vlogs that I put out, please consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.